devoted to highlighting innovative advances in cognitive neuroscience. We acknowledge that these schools are elite institutes, and so to widely spread knowledge beyond this ivory tower, we plan to make these talks publicly available with closed captioning, with the consent of our speakers, on our website for this talk series and on the website for Center for Cognitive Neuroscience at Dartmouth College. On behalf of ICN, we are beyond thrilled to have Dr. Buddhika Bellana here today speaking with us. Dr. Bellana is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Glendon, New York University in Toronto, Ontario. He received his PhD from the University of Toronto under the mentorship of Cheryl Grady and Morris Moskovich. His doctoral work focused on how prior knowledge may promote detail-rich memories in the default mode network. He built upon this work in a postdoctoral fellowship at Johns Hopkins University, working with Janice Chen and Chris Honey. There, he used techniques from natural language processing and naturalistic neuroimaging to investigate how stories can change the way that we think. He's broadly interested in why the brain has an affinity for certain types of information, and ultimately how it is scaffolded to generate a sense of deep understanding. So with that, let's give a virtual round of applause for Dr. Bellana in anticipation of this talk titled How Narrative Thinking Lingers in Spontaneous Thought.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. So I will get started. Thank you all for having me. And kind of before I begin, I just want to mention the charity organization, or the organization that I chose, which is Resource Generation and Resource Movement. It's based on the idea of income inequality. So as academics, many of us were able to pursue this career path because we had money to be able to pay for post-secondary education, or the financial stability or security to be able to spend several years learning and training. And not everyone has that kind of money or time. And it's not just academic careers that are at stake, but when certain people are not given access or systematically lack access to this kind of financial stability, for example, in terms of race, it limits their ability to be safe and determine how their lives unfold. And for example, like having access to financial security, whether it be via your own savings or support from your family, casts like a safety net that allows many of us to overcome financial obstacles, like having to buy a new laptop because it just died, or having to relocate because their landlords want to sell their houses, without these obstacles really like snowballing into something more severe. And Resource Generation and the Canada-based Resource Movement are organizations that work towards helping individuals with wealth spread that wealth and help use that wealth to build safety nets for communities in need and people who might not typically have access to these kinds of safety nets. They campaign for a bunch of ways to accomplish this, and one example is like taxing inheritance, which can essentially work to take wealth from individuals and build more robust social supports. You can learn more about what they do at their websites, and they kind of talk about a lot of their plans and their campaigns there as well. And one little example that I want to point out is actually from Resource Movement. So this is a Canada-based one. It's called the Rapid Response List, which actually allows people who have access to this kind of wealth to share it with individuals pretty much at no barrier. So if an individual reaches out to the Rapid Response List because maybe, for example, they don't have money for rent this month, then individuals with wealth are able to provide funds to these people to help them essentially not have these issues become monumental roadblocks in their life. So class inequality and Resource Movement are the kinds of organizations that I just wanted to bring up. Now, with that aside, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the science I've been doing. And the talk is about narrative thinking and how it can linger in our spontaneous thoughts. So, as psychologists, we're interested in mental states, how we think and what we think about. And the architecture of our mental system, there's an important feature that kind of determines our mental states, and that feature is history dependence. History dependence is the idea that if we consider a given mental state at a given moment in time, what it is actually, or what determines a given mental state at a given moment in time are the previous mental states. So our past experiences shape present moment cognition. You can kind of think about this as like recent experiences having kind of momentum, psychological momentum, pushing forward, shaping present moment cognition. And you can find tons of examples of history dependence deciding whether a word was a word or not a word. Like for example, the word butter. You had to decide whether it was a word or not. The speed with which you were able to make that decision depends or can be affected by the words that you had seen previously. So seeing the word bread speeds up your ability to make a lexical decision for the word butter. So you can see your past mental state, what happened in the past, can shape present moment cognition. Similarly, you can see that kind of effect in free recall. So if you were to study a list of words like ketchup, forest, window, horse, and tornado, and you wanted to know what a given person was going to recall at a given moment in time, looking at what they recalled previously would give you some kind of information, an index as to what they were going to recall next. So for example, seeing the word horse or recalling the word horse would mean that you're more likely to recall the subsequent word from that list. So in this case, tornado. So again, we can see that our past experiences can shape present moment cognition. And this idea relates quite strongly to the notion of a stream of thought or stream of consciousness, which was very eloquently described by William James in his Principles of Psychology. And this is a quote that I like in particular. It's that experience is remolding us every moment, and our mental reaction on any given thing is really resultant of our experience of the whole world up to that date. So here you can see that cognition is like deeply and profoundly autocorrelated. It's not just discrete idiosyncratic events, but instead a continuous stream where a past moment shapes subsequent moments. And one thing that I kind of want to point out is the kinds of examples that we have of this autocorrelation, for example, in the form of priming and free recall, seem to kind of lack the magnitude of the stream of consciousness and the autocorrelated nature that William James is describing. So this history dependence is not just like from one trial to the next, if you consider what William James is describing. Here, it's something far more profound, that we're continuously embedded in this stream, and it can have lasting influences on us, not just, for example, from one discrete trial from before, but are several moments and minutes into the past. And what I want to get at in this talk is kind of tapping into this rich version of history dependency cognition. In specific, I'm going to ask a question, which is, why some experiences or ways of thinking seem to linger in our minds for longer than others. So for example, if you take the example of a compelling story, I like to go on our books, which is a great subreddit if you want to think about reading. And this post was one by a random ginger, the username actually. And what they said was, does reading a book change who you are temporarily? And this person, Alphabet278, had just finished reading Angels and Demons by Dan Brown, and they described being in a trance for hours. Their girlfriend couldn't even communicate properly with them because they seemed to phase out every now and then, and they realized that they were thinking about everything that happened in the book. Here, you can see that the experience of reading Dan Brown seems to have a lasting influence on how we think for several minutes after it ends. Kind of more profound and prominent than what you would think of, for example, in the context of free recall or semantic priming, like the examples I showed you before. And another post which I liked was this idea of a book hangover, which is described by another user on Reddit. And this is another little e-card that I found where someone described the phenomenon again. And the book hangover is the inability to start a new book because you're still living in the last book's world. So here you can really see that people are feeling this persistence from past experiences profoundly shaping present moment cognition. And you can find similar examples of this even outside of books. For example, if you look at role-playing video games, this is a paper focusing on people who play World of Warcraft, and they actually report something called game transfer phenomena, which is elements of the game carrying over to the real lives of lives outside of the game of many of these players. And it seems to be something particular to role-playing games. And we also know that emotions and social experiences tend to have this sticky perseverative quality. For example, at the level of cognition, if you think of rumination, or even in the level of the brain, if you think about how emotional brain states can persist and carry over and shape present moment cognition. So this is all to say, what is it about our memory system that causes causes these types of experiences, compelling narratives, role-playing video games, emotions, and social experiences, to persist and shape our cognition well beyond the period when that experience actually ends. What can that tell us about how our memory system works? And what I'm going to hypothesize today is that these are all examples of something called deep processing. And this is, I'm drawing from the work of Levels of Processing from Craig and Lockhart in the 70s, where the idea was you can process a given input at many different levels of depth. For example, at a shallow level, you're paying attention to the concrete and physical properties of stimulus, while at a deep level, you're attending to the abstract and conceptual meaning. So for example, if you think of a word, if you're having to make a decision about the word in terms of whether it was italicized or not, if it was on screen, that would be an example of shallow processing, while deep processing instead would be attending to what that word actually means rather than its physical features. And when you think about stories, role-playing video games, or emotions and social experiences, these are all experiences in which you are not really paying attention to the concrete features of the experience itself, but instead their implications, what they mean for you, or in the case of a story, the worlds that they evoke. It's not the words themselves, but it's the implied worlds that they evoke, and in terms of social experiences and emotions, it's what they mean for your life subsequently. And this focus or emphasis on abstract, conceptual, deep meaning might kind of tell us, or might be a feature as to why these experiences last. We know from the study of human memory that deep processing can lead to better explicit memory. Perhaps it also leads to like this lasting, lingering mental context that I've been describing in these previous examples. So, how did we go about actually testing this in the lab? What we did was we had participants read a short story, one sentence at a time, online. And the first story that I'm going to focus on is one by Raymond Carver. It's called So Much Water, So Close to Home. And it's essentially I would say 12 to 15 minute read. It's under 3,000 words, and it's about a husband and a wife. The husband goes on a camping trip. On this camping trip, he finds a dead body, and he returns home and tells his wife that he found a dead body on his camping trip. But his wife realizes that he didn't really show too much urgency when he found the body. They continued having their trip, and his wife begins to start to suspect that maybe her husband had more of an active role in finding this body than he's letting on. So you have this kind of like suspense and build-up in terms of the relationship between these two people, and that's the window you have. That's what the story kind of gives you a window into that experience. So participants in the lab were reading this story one sentence at a time online, and we bookended this reading task with free association. And by free association, I mean participants were asked to type whatever words came to mind as they came to mind for 5 minutes before and after reading the story. And to give you a sense of what that looked like, I'm going to show you a little clip. Just know that it begins with a cue word that's related to the story. In this case, it's going to be water. That's what you see here. And then participants would type whatever words came to mind as they came to mind for 5 minutes before and after reading the story. And this task, the goal of this task was to provide an unconstrained kind of measure that would give us insight into the spontaneous thoughts of our participants, again, before and after reading the story. And if stories have this ability to exert some kind of lasting, lingering mental context that shapes spontaneous thought after reading the story actually ends, then you might expect the story to color free association after reading as compared to before. So there might be some kind of change in free association post-story as compared to pre. And maybe the magnitude of this difference, if deep processing matters, should be most prominent when participants are reading an intact narrative as compared to a version of the same story where the order of the sentences are randomly scrambled, because there, now you no longer have access to the overarching sentence meaning, but instead have only access to the individual sentence level meaning. And if you would expect even a lesser reduced effect for participants in the word scrambled condition, where now you don't even have sentence level meaning, you only have access to the word meanings themselves. And again, deeper processing, you can think of the intact conditions being deeper processing, because now the words are kind of embedded in these broader situations. We're able to essentially take the words of the story and build an alternate world. And the extent to which you can do that is likely to be reduced when the sentence order is scrambled, and particularly when the word order is scrambled. So if deep processing actually matters, or predicts the extent to which an experience lingers in mind, you would expect it to be most prominent for intact narratives as compared to sentence scrambled. So, I'm going to take some water. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the data, some of the results. So first, I'm going to focus on subjective experience, how our participants felt when they performed this task. And I'm going to focus on this measure called transportation, which is by Melanie Green's group, and it taps into the extent to which an individual felt transported into the world of the story. So you can kind of think of it as the extent to which you're in the story world as compared to in your seat. And I would argue that this is a proxy for deep processing, because the extent to which you're able to create this alternate world and immerse yourself in it would kind of indicate that you're engaging with the rich conceptual meaning and building a situation model from the text itself. So you're engaging in that kind of deep processing that I was describing before. And in line with that, as you can see, each point here is a participant, that participants in the intact condition showed more transportation or engaged in more deep processing than participants in the sentence scrambled or word scrambled condition, as one might expect. But we weren't just interested in the extent to which you were immersed in the story while reading it. Our focus, as I've been talking about history, dependence, and lingering, is the extent to which that experience can carry forward in time. So to what extent, we asked our participants, in fact, to what extent did the text linger in your mind after reading it? And a 7, in this case, would mean very much, and a 1, in this case, would mean not at all. And what you can see here is that participants in the intact condition, again, reported that they felt like the text persisted in their mind more prominently than participants in the sentence scrambled or word scrambled condition, in line with the idea that deep processing, engaging with this rich situation level meaning, seemed to have some kind of consequence on the extent to which that text persisted and shaped their spontaneous thoughts. So I'm saying that stories are lingering in mind, but what exactly does that mean? For example, what is the nature of the representations that are persisting in mind? And that's the question. And what I'm going to show you here is some self-report when we asked our participants that very question. The majority of participants, as you can see with this score over here, were reporting a change in the topics of words that were coming to mind during post-story free association. So they felt like it was some kind of change, particularly in the semantics of the thoughts that were coming to mind. But others also reported a change in domain general difficulty, how easy it was to access words during free association changed before as compared to after reading the story. And others even described it as some kind of change in the emotions that they felt during the valence of the words and thoughts that came to mind. But it wasn't so commonly described as something like boredom or tiredness. It seems to be content related to either the semantic features of the story, the emotional valence, or some kind of domain general property in how participants were thinking. So it seems to be some kind of multifaceted piece, but most prominently a change in the topics that were coming to mind. And another quality that I want to point out about this lingering of stories is its intentionality. So the question is, was it volitional or not? Did participants choose to rehearse or think about the story after it ended, or was it something that kind of happened against their will or unintentionally, just persisting in their minds? And here is a waffle plot where each square represents a participant, and you can kind of see the proportion of participants who reported different qualities when it came to describing their self-reported lingering. And what you can see is that the majority of participants tended to describe this lingering experience as unintentional. They didn't intend for the story to persist in their mind. It kind of happened without any intention whatsoever. And what this is interesting because it kind of shows that it's not explicit rehearsal. It's not that participants are reading the story and then just rehearsing it in mind. Or it also shows that this is quite different from the kinds of measures that deep processing typically benefits. So in the study of memory, deep processing an input typically leads to better performance on tasks of explicit memory in the form of recognition or free recall. But here, participants are describing some kind of change in their spontaneous thoughts that was not volitional, it was not intentional, it was just a latent constraint which seemed to shape how and what they were thinking about. So, I've been talking about self-report, but can we go beyond self-report? Can we actually find some kind of objective changes in how participants are thinking beyond their own descriptions? And to that end, we can kind of reframe that question as whether or not you can tell the difference between free association before reading the story and free association after reading the story. The extent to which you can tell the difference would suggest that there's some kind of change in free association after reading the story that likely is driven by the story itself. And maybe the magnitude of that difference could be impacted by whether or not participants read an intact story or a sentence scrambled or word scrambled story, kind of in line with the ideas of deep processing that I've been putting forward. So if participants are reading a deeply processed or intact story, you would expect more of a drastic objective difference in the content of free association before reading the story versus after, as compared to participants who are reading a sentence scrambled or word scrambled version of the same story. So we did this in two ways. One is using document classification, which we relied on linear support vector machines to essentially train models based on the words that participants were generating. So based on their free association chains, we would train a model to predict whether a held out chain was generated pre-story or post-story. And another way we did that was using theme similarity, which relies on, instead of document classification, word embeddings, which are essentially automated ways to compute the meaning of a word. And using these embedding vectors that represent the word's position in semantic space, we can calculate the proximity of participants' free associates to the core story themes, and calculate whether, after reading the story, there was some kind of persistence of story-related features in participants' free associations. So, for the sake of time, I'm going to focus more so on the theme similarity measure. But if anyone has any questions about document classification, I'd be happy to discuss it with those up. So, before I get to theme similarity in particular, I want to ask the question of what exactly is lingering. And the extent to which I can kind of demonstrate that to you is by showing you differences in probability that words occur in a free association chain after reading the story as compared to before. So these are participants who read the Carver story that I had talked about. And words that are going to have a higher value on the y-axis here would be words that are more likely to occur post-story, and the words that occur with a lower value here are more likely to occur pre-story. So now what we're going to do is take a look at some of the data itself, and each point here represents a word that occurred from our actual participants' free association, and the size of these circles represents the probability of it occurring in a free association chain before reading the story. So what you can see is that there's a bunch of words that are popping up at the high end of this graph. Words like river, murder, dead, funeral, and death. And these are words that were prominent in participants' free association, particularly after reading the Carver story. And it makes sense, given that the Carver story was about essentially finding a dead body on a camping trip, which happened to be near a river, and there was suspicions in terms of the husband maybe actually committing murder. And in the story, the wife actually attended a funeral, and that was an element of the story. And you can kind of see these features occurring in free association, suggesting that it's the story themes that might be persisting in post-story thought. And the extent to which this occurs seems to be more prominent for participants in intact conditions, as you can see with these higher expressions of these theme words, than participants in the sentence scrambled condition, and especially participants in the word scrambled condition. So here, participants are reading the same words that make up the story, so they're seeing the words like murder, death, and funeral. However, you don't see these words perseverating in participants' spontaneous thoughts after reading the story whatsoever. Instead, you see words that are like wash, grass, food, and family, suggesting that the coherence of the story, the extent to which you're actually able to access that deep situation level meaning, seems to relate to the persistence of these elements in spontaneous thought. And one possibility that we need to rule out is that this is actually an effect of reading the story itself, rather than one of time. For example, one alternate possibility, though maybe hard to believe, would be that over time, participants just talk about murder, rivers, and death. But we actually had a separate group of participants do the same task while reading a different story. This was one by Miranda July, which was called Boy Spivvy, and was essentially about the narrator meeting a celebrity on an airplane and having a chance kind of romantic encounter with them. They really got along. It was really lovely. The celebrity was an actor in spy movies, and when the plane landed, they realized that they would no longer be able to be in touch. So the actor gave the narrator his phone number and withheld one number from his phone number, and that number was the number 4, and he asked her to kind of commit that to memory. So anyways, if you take a look at the words that were most prominent in participants' free association after reading this July story, you can see that it's like the word number, man, phone, spy, and 4, which are all, again, as I just described, related to the themes of the story. And it's not that just like over time there's some kind of general change in the words that participants produce, but instead they seem to be yoked to the past experience. So that recent experience of reading the story seems to have some kind of momentum that helps carry over into spontaneous thought after reading it. And again, this was more prominent for the participants in the intact condition as compared to those in the sentence scrambled condition. So again, what's lingering? It seems to be story themes. But how can we actually measure that directly? So how can we measure the extent to which story themes are expressed in free association? So we did this in, this is one way that we did this. We had participants produce, after reading the story, they were asked to describe the story in 10 words. So essentially they had to take the story and downsample it to 10 words and describe it in 10 words. And these are the 10 words that were most frequent across our participants for each of the conditions. So in the intact condition, you can see the words that came out most frequently across participants. In the sentence scrambled condition and the word scrambled condition. This is for the Carver story. And what you can see is that there's a fair amount of consistency. Words like murder, death, and funeral are occurring. It's a little less prominent in the word scrambled condition, but you can still see that you can extract to some extent the themes that are most reliable across our participants for these given texts. So the question then might be, how close semantically are the free associates that our participants are producing spontaneously to these core story themes? And we answer that question again using word embeddings. Particularly, we use glove word embeddings, which essentially provide a 300-dimensional vector that represents a word's position in semantic space. So if two words have similar vectors or positions in semantic space, they're likely to be used in natural language in similar contexts and therefore share meaning. So what you could do is, and this is a 2-dimensional example of these word embeddings, you could take each of the theme words for a given subject in a given condition and get their word embeddings, which would be vectors in a 300-dimensional space, but in this case, it's a 2-dimensional one, so we can actually see it and make sense of it. Then, what you can do is take each subject's individual free associates and get their word embeddings and plot them in the same 300-dimensional space. And then by taking the cosine similarity, or calculating the similarity of the angle of these two vectors, you can calculate which theme is each associate most semantically similar to. And if you do that for every word in participants' free association before reading the story, then do it for every word after reading the story, you can do this comparison and see the extent to which story themes perseverate in post-story as compared to pre-story thoughts. And that's what you see directly here, this y-axis. The question that this is kind of asking is how close are the free associates to the core story theme semantically? Higher values of theme similarity indicate closer proximity to the story themes, and lower values means that the free associates are actually not so similar to the core story themes. And here, each point is a participant, and each participant will technically have 2 points, one for pre and one for post connected by a line. And what you can see here is that there's a positive slope. Participants tend to produce words that are more semantically similar in terms of our glove word embeddings to the core story themes, particularly after reading the story as compared to before. And this is in line with what I was showing you looking at the probabilities that I was just describing it, but we can actually calculate the extent to which that's true directly from all of our data using these word embedding techniques. And interestingly, this was also possible for the sentence scrambled word, but you can kind of see the slope of this effect was slightly reduced. And if you look at participants in the word scrambled word, it was absolutely flat, suggesting that just seeing the words, technically the same words that make up the story, do not allow you to, or do not prime those words enough to persist in spontaneous thought to the extent at which coherent stories and even intact sentence level stories could. But what we did, in addition to this, as I mentioned from the Miranda July stories, we ran a few other stories, and we can kind of see the consistency of these effects across multiple data sets. So we had one condition where we actually replicated the same Carver story. So we had an intact and sentence scrambled condition, and again you can see a steeper slope for the intact condition than the sentence scrambled condition, suggesting that story themes are perseverating in post-story thoughts more so when the story is intact. And we also had participants read a rewrite of the Carver story. So here, it's actually the same content, it's about the same plot, but it was actually using different words. Instead of written by a famous author, it was written by me, so a poor version of the same story, but still expressing the same content. And again, the intact condition showed a significant change from pre to post, more so than the sentence scrambled condition. And finally, in the Miranda July story that I alluded to earlier, you can again see that it's not even a particular feature of this Carver story that I happen to choose, but something that seems to be general to stories. Stories, when they're intact, seem to have this kind of psychological momentum that carries that recent experience forward into subsequent cognition. So, in other words, story themes linger in our post-story thoughts, and this seems to be especially the case when stories are intact. So, this brings us to a big question. Why? Why should stories linger in our minds? And I'm going to come back to this idea of deep processing. Again, you can maybe think about this example yoked to a specific word. So if you think of the word mother, you can process this word mother shallowly in the case of, for example, attending to its orthography or typography. For example, is the word mother, in this case, italicized? That would be an example of you shallowly processing that word. You're attending to the word's physical features, but not actually what it means. Alternatively, you could process this word in terms of its semantics. So attending to the word's actual abstract and conceptual meaning. For example, if you're asking whether or not this word represented something concrete or abstract. So we know that if you were to engage in the kinds of deep processing examples that I just showed, you would have better explicit memory, whether in terms of recognition or recall for words, as compared to the shallow processing condition. But these are just still examples that are operating at the level of words. That's typically how deep processing has been examined in the literature. However, what if you were to take this word and embed it into a sentence? For example, this sentence, mother died today. You can see that the meaning is increasing. How about if you were to embed it in a paragraph? For example, mother died today, or maybe yesterday, I don't know. I had a telegram from home, mother passed away, funeral tomorrow, yours sincerely. That doesn't mean anything. It may have been yesterday. Or you could have all of these words and sentences and paragraphs embedded in a story. For example, A Stranger by opinion. And you can see that the meaning of this given word is magnified, amplified massively when you go from words to the word mother. Now, in the context of the sentence, the paragraph, to the narrative, carries so much more meaning. So it seems like maybe if you were to think about this in the context of deep processing, the narrative seems to really amplify the extent to which you're engaging with the meaning of the stimulus, more so than the typical manipulations that we use in the levels of processing framework, for example, attending to whether it's tangible or concrete or abstract, for example. And this kind of like magnitude or amplification of the extent to what a single element means is kind of a core feature of what stories do. Stories are not composed just of words, but in fact, their core elements might be events. And when you think of an event in the story, in order to understand what the story is about, you have to think about not just what a given event means, but how it relates to other events in the story. And that can be thought of as a network. So stories are composed of highly interrelated events. And in order to understand the story overall, you need to consider the relationships, not the relationships between the elements, not just what the element itself means. And beyond these across-element associations that are kind of critical for understanding a story, you also embed it in a situation. You think about what the characters are going through, how they're feeling, what this decision or this action means for them in their lives and their story world subsequently. And perhaps engaging in this kind of like mentalizing or situation model building, or just really engaging with the story and situation, could be even deeper than just attending to a cross-element association. So maybe we can go back to our model or the existing framework of levels of processing and extend it deeper. So instead of just single element semantics, maybe cross-element associations are deeper than just the single level element semantics. And maybe attending to stories and situations are deeper still. And if these are deeper, then they should lead to more robust representations in memory, but maybe not just in terms of explicit memory, maybe also in terms of this more latent, unintentional, lasting mental context that shapes spontaneous cognition, kind of like the lingering we've been reporting so far. And is there any evidence that depth of processing kind of drives lingering beyond the condition level manipulations that I've shown you so far? And I'm going to take you to this correlation plot, which is looking at all the data that I've described so far and showing you the relationship between transportation, which again is the extent to which you're immersed in the world of the story while reading it. And I would consider this a measure of depth of processing while reading, the extent to which you're actually able to build an alternate world from the story elements, and look at its relationship to self-reported lingering on the y-axis, the extent to which participants felt that the story persisted in their minds. And what you can see are really strong correlations between the extent to which you deeply engage with the stimulus while reading it and the lasting effects that participants feel afterwards. You can see that participants who are deeply immersed in the story while reading it seem to be the ones that show this lasting persistence of that experience in mind. And importantly, it seems to be irrespective of the objective coherence of the stimulus that's being read. So it's not that the input is coherent objectively, but it's the extent to which you as an individual were able to take that input and make sense of it that seems to be predictive, or most predictive, of the extent to which that experience then persists in your spontaneous thoughts. And I ran a few subsequent experiments to kind of like further point out this possibility. So one was where we recent experiment where we actually had participants read intact stories and manipulate the depth of processing of an intact story using a different cover task. So for example, we had participants, a separate set of participants, read the Carver story, but performing an emotional judgment for each sentence in the story. So essentially they had to decide whether each sentence contributed to positively, negatively, or in a neutral valence to the overall story at that point. So essentially they're making a judgment about what that sentence kind of feels and how it contributes to the overall the story. They're attending to the story's meaning. And a separate group of participants read the same part of the story. This time, they were in a proofreading condition. And you might notice that in the story written here, there was a typo. So we actually embedded the story with spelling typos, or with spelling errors and font errors. So essentially, oddball font, so it wasn't the font that the rest of the story was in. And participants had to essentially, in the proofread condition, count the number of spelling errors and font errors that were occurring in each sentence. So here, they don't need to engage with the overall meaning of the story. Technically, they could perform this task on randomly scrambled words, but it's the coherent story. They're going to read it because they need to read it to find spelling errors. So you're actually manipulating the depth with which they're processing that story input. And as I was saying, the emotion condition is deeper than the proofreading condition. And in line with that, if you take a self-reported look at self-reported lingering, you can see that participants in the emotion condition reported more of this experience of lingering than participants in the proofreading condition, despite the fact that they were both reading coherent stories. And if you were actually to look at our objective measures, this is an example of the document classifier. You could see that our document classifier was actually able to predict above chance. So prediction was probably around 63%, and this null distribution is chance. You could see that our classifier was performing above chance for participants in the emotion condition, but not the proofreading condition. So here, our model was able to tell the difference between pre and post chains above chance, but for the emotion participants, but not participants in the proofreading condition. And we also had participants do a separate task where they're actually, this is a different set of participants, where we showed them a list of words and manipulated the extent to which they deeply process this word list, again using different cover tasks. So this is an example of italicized. You're essentially judging whether a word was italicized or not, so you can kind of see what it looks like here. But we actually had 4 conditions: participants deciding whether each word was italicized or not, or a deeper condition where they were deciding whether each word was something tangible or not, something that could behold. So there you have to think about what the word means. And we compared these to even deeper levels of processing, where you had to think about what the word meant in relationship to other words. That was in the theme condition and the story condition, where we told participants that this list of words that they were processing, in fact, had a hidden theme or a hidden story embedded in it. And they had to decide whether each word belonged to this kind of hidden theme or hidden story or not, forcing them not only to think about the meaning of each individual word, but think about how they relate to one another, which I was trying to argue might be an example of deeper processing than just, for example, the tangible condition. And in line with that idea, participants were able to read this sentence that was not a narrative, a list of discrete words, and were able to report more self-reported lingering, particularly when they were engaging in this deeper kind of processing of this words as compared to the shallower levels of processing. So, take home, what does this all mean? Well, I hope I've convinced you that the extent to which our thoughts and minds have this kind of history dependence doesn't seem to be a fixed parameter. It's not like a constant rate at all times. Instead, it seems to be perhaps a function of encoding depth. How deeply we process a given input predicts the extent to which it persists in our mind subsequently. And given that stories are an excellent kind of stimulus to engage or elicit deep processing, coherent and immersive, engaging stories tend to persist in our minds, shaping our spontaneous thoughts, often against our own intentions. And just kind of wrap up, I'm hoping to pursue this line of work in the future, looking at the neural mechanisms. What are the brain systems that actually support this perseverance of recent experience? Could it be long, slow, temporal receptive window kinds of DMN, default mode network regions, that can maintain cortically this information over time? Or is it maybe more reliant on our episodic memory system, like the hippocampus, maybe via some mechanisms like hippocampal replay? And this lingering might be the subjective correlate of the replay of recently encoded past experiences. And similarly, if lingering might be related to mechanisms like hippocampal replay, could lingering promote post-encoding consolidation? Does it maybe allow us to prioritize meaningful experiences in memory and allow us to kind of form more lasting memories for those inputs? And lastly, I'm hoping to do some modeling work to better specify how we move from thought to thought and how deep processing might actually be operationalized. I'm doing some of that work with a colleague of mine, Vincent. And that's everything. So I wanted to thank you all for your time and attention, and I wanted to thank my postdoc advisors, Chris Honey and Janice Chen, for the excellent, and my PhD advisor, Cheryl Brady and Morris Moskvich, for also being peerless, and all the lovely people who've been my colleagues throughout years who have made this and my ability to do science super fun and enjoyable. And yeah, I want to thank the organizers for having me.
Thanks so much for an awesome talk. We've got a number of questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to just read those out by like what's been upvoted the most. Order. So Jeremy Manning asked, do you think that there's something special about certain experiences, e.g. some experiences stick or transfer and others don't? Or are all experiences sticky to some extent and it's really more of a continuum or a spectrum?
I think it's more of a continuum, but like, yeah, so it's more of a, it's not that like certain types of experiences in particular stick. I think it's more of a continuum, and I think the wordless experiment kind of like shows that a little bit. So I do think, for example, like stories have like a architecture. They have a certain shape maybe in terms of how we engage with them. That kind of facilitates deep processing. So social experiences might have that as well, where and the video game kind of example that I mentioned, where like the point of that kind of experience is to engage with what the stimulus means rather than its low-level features. But we as individuals are able to make sense of tons of things. So if you were to look at some of the data that I presented, even for the word scrambled condition or the sentence scrambled condition, participants were able to feel transported by the task or into the story, even though it didn't necessarily make too much coherent sense objectively. So I think it's definitely like an interaction. So it feels like the continuum would be a better fit for that explanation, because you could take an experience that, for example, maybe if you were to like read a terms and agreements for like, you know, some app that you downloaded, which probably wouldn't linger because you probably don't read it so intently or read it at all. But if maybe you were you were the one who wrote it, and like you cared about how it was written, or you do like copyright law, and then like maybe that stimulus actually means something to you, then that stimulus could persist. So I think that then the continuum kind of example fits a little better for how my interpretation of how this game.
Awesome, that makes a lot of sense. Roni Seton, sorry if I mispronounced anyone's name, asks, do you also see the storing lingering effect at longer time scale than what you presented today?
Yeah, actually, I have like a plot that shows the effect kind of windowed over time. So here you can kind of see, rather than just looking at the 5 minutes averaged overall, you can see the effect size of the difference between pre to post for each 10 associate in free association. So rather than averaging all of it for the 5 minutes of free association, I'm kind of plotting it somewhat in time. And you can see that the effect varies across the different experiments, but overall seems to be more persistent for the intact condition than sentence scrambled condition and word scrambled condition. But it doesn't even, in our case, last the full 5 minutes of free association. You can see it level out around the 30 free associate point. And that is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot, because when I think of those examples from the subreddit stuff I was showing you from our books, those people are talking about like minutes, sometimes days of a story persisting in your mind. And what we're able to show right now is like under 5 minutes, but which is still long for some examples of priming. And it's like this is super noisy and constrained task, so you're able to show that it's working despite that. But it feels different from the extent to which the subjective experience is actually occurring. And And I think that's because we're using a free association task that's operating at the level of words. When a story is lingering in your mind, it's not just words that are persisting, it's like probably some more complex mental representations of events, of thoughts, concepts, ideas, feelings, that kind of stuff is in. But we're tapping into it using a free word association task. So I think if we were able to use maybe some more of these talk aloud or unconstrained kinds of free association tasks, maybe we could find the persistence of these effects a little longer.
Awesome. Another question that says deep processing isn't unidimensional. What if I process story by emotional impact or cognitive coherence? I think you kind of touched on that in your answer, but do you have anything more to add?
Yeah, for sure the dimensions by which, like, when I talk about depth of processing, I just mean the number of like associates a given input would have so that you're accessing. So for example, if you were to think about your mind as a network and a node is something that you're thinking about, then if you were to ping that node, how many other nodes get pinged to? It's likely that different kinds of information might linger longer than other kinds, but I haven't really had the opportunity to dive into that, and I think that's definitely a super interesting line of work.
Green Alzahab asks, can we determine if the PRE free association exercise biases responding in addition to reading the story?
So I maybe if I was to guess what that means, I think you mean like, does doing free association just have some kind of consequence on free association after reading the story, maybe? Like the fact that you did it once affects how you do it later? I think probably. People definitely, report feeling like the second time is a little bit easier sometimes, and that was even true for some people in the word scrambled condition, suggesting that maybe there's like practice effects that are happening. But what we're reporting seems to be over and above, given that it's like related to story-specific themes. So, yeah. Hopefully I got that.
Hopefully it answers the question. I didn't really grasp it. But right in the chat, if not. Jinming Zhu asks, is it possible to directly measure the cost of lingering, like worse performance on some tasks afterwards, e.g. the situation on Reddit?
Yeah, no, totally. So that's something that I'm hoping to do. Currently, we're just capturing the concept, like the fact that something does linger in spontaneous thoughts. But you would imagine, given the people's subjective descriptions of what lingering feels like, it should have consequences in subsequent tasks. So maybe if you were to perform some kind of, you were to read a subsequent story and do a comprehension test on that subsequent story, maybe your memory for that story or understanding of that story will be reduced. But also you might expect that it's possible if you were to like study a word list, and maybe that mental context from the story adds meaning to like take a otherwise meaningless list of words and kind of embed it in some kind of meaningful structure, acting as a scaffold to improve subsequent memory. So I think that's definitely a line of work that I'm going to get into, and yeah, I hope to have some answers at some point in the near future.
Next question. Do you think there would be sex or age differences in the different narrative scenarios in terms of lingering?
I think when you're dealing with stimuli like stories, all of these factors matter, because some stories are rich and they resonate with different people for different reasons. And currently, I haven't really done too much mapping of that space. I've just kind of been using stories as a monolith. This is a story. This is what stories do, which is kind of inappropriate. And Claire Grawl actually has a cool paper kind of talking about that in cognitive neuroscience we treat stories as monoliths. So I definitely think the extent to which a story resonates with you seems to be what determines lingering. So if certain stories might resonate with older people or people of a certain gender, then maybe that story would then those factors would have some kind of influence on lingering for sure.
A lot more questions, and I'll try to get them to them. Okay, Alina Dratova asks, what, according to you, is the relationship between a semantically related set of sentences, which could be an uneventful description of, e.g., a church interior, or a single event, but still not a scrambled set of sentences, and a story, which is more complicated structure and identifiable beginning and end, a pattern, some of which are cultural universals, etc. And could we get at this difference if you think it exists experimentally?
Yeah, I presume there's a difference based on like the subjective experience of like reading stories. The experience of reading story, like stories, give rise to worlds, and like that's really different. I find, and I think many people find from like just reading other kinds of related or unrelated sentences. Like, they don't necessarily so easily give rise to like entire worlds and mental lives that are so rich and immersive. So I imagine that there is a real difference between that. And to get at it experimentally, I think it's a little tougher because you have to find ways to like take a narrative and um, make it less narrative and somehow like make it more like a flat description of text and kind of that's a difficult thing to do. We've done some work trying to do that, but where, for example, in the version where of the Carver rewrite that I described, that I rewrote the Carver story, that was with the intention of trying to make it flat, and we failed. Participants still reported that it was transported, and I think it's because sometimes certain kinds of content are just immersive. Even though I was writing it kind of in a boring way, it was still about like a husband and wife, their interactions and a murder, and like the thick social emotional interactions that we're having between these people. So I think being able to do that is tough, but it's something that I'd like to work on, and I think that difference exists, but it's just difficult to operationalize. I'm hoping to do some stuff looking at non-narrative stimuli and expertise. So if you're really familiar with a given topic, then maybe something that is more like this description of a church. If you are a church designer or architect, then maybe that would linger for you as compared to me, for example.
Awesome. Great answer. I think we'll end the question for this session now, since it's right at 1. And I'll post the link to the trainee session if anyone would like to transport over to there. And we can ask some more questions in a more informal, still Zoom setting. So I'll just post that here. Oh, Adam just posted it. But thank you to everyone attending. Thank you for a fabulous talk. So we'll just give a virtual round of applause again.
Thank you for having me, for organizing this project. It's super cool. And for all the questions and interested people, I really appreciate it. If I didn't answer your question, feel free to reach out on Twitter, and I can try my best to do so later.
Recording stopped.
Thanks, everyone.